My son-in-law, Caleb, sat across from me in my own study, a serene, predatory smile on his face. He and his associate had just presented me with a stack of papers that felt heavier than a tombstone. "So, as you can see, Art," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble, "the sale is final. We've optimized your assets. You'll be moving into the Magnolia Senior Wellness Community next Friday." His confidence was absolute, seeing me as just one final, predictable move in a game he'd already won. But a good chess player never reveals his strategy until the final move. I simply looked at him, then at the smirking notary beside him, and gave a calm nod. "That sounds efficient," I said. "Before we go there, though, let's take a drive to the police station. Detective Flores is expecting us. She's fascinated by the digital evidence I sent her about your consulting work in Atlanta and Charleston." Those words were the checkmate he never saw coming. Before we dive into how I turn the tables on a master manipulator, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you're having for dinner tonight. It really helps the channel. It all began on a Thursday, exactly 1 week after my daughter Jenna's wedding. The Savannah air, thick with the sweet scent of jasmine and the faint, briny tang of the nearby marshes, drifted through the open windows of my old Victorian home. This house wasn't just wood and plaster to me, it was a library of my life. Every creaky floorboard, every pane of wavy, century-old glass held a memory of my late wife Eleanor and of raising Jenna within these walls. As a retired history professor, I understood the weight of the past. It wasn't a burden, it was an anchor. I spent that morning like most others, with a cup of black coffee, a history of the Byzantine Empire, and a half-finished game of chess set up on the mahogany table in the sunroom, the ivory pieces gleaming in the morning light. When Jenna called, her voice was bubbling with the kind of pure, unadulterated joy that a father lives to hear. "Dad!" Caleb and I were thinking, could we take you out for a proper 1-week anniversary dinner tonight to celebrate and thank you again for everything? We want to go somewhere special. I couldn't say no to that voice. For years after her mother passed, and especially after her difficult divorce, I'd watched a shadow hang over Jenna. Seeing her so full of life again, so confident in her future with Caleb, felt like the sun breaking through a long and dreary winter. Caleb Thorne. He was handsome, charismatic, and talked a big game. He was a life coach and an aspirational strategist who spoke in a language of synergy, intentionality, and living your optimized truth. To my old-fashioned ears, it sounded like a lot of well-packaged air, but it made Jenna happy. He made her feel seen and empowered, and for that, I was willing to overlook my own quiet skepticism. He was always perfectly charming to me, always asking questions about my life, my finances, the history of the house, an interest I'd mistaken for genuine filial curiosity. That evening, we sat in a plush booth at the Old Pink House, one of Savannah's most historic restaurants. The candlelight danced across Jenna's smiling face as she recounted stories from their honeymoon. Caleb sat beside her, his arm draped protectively around her, looking every bit the perfect, doting husband. He raised his glass of wine. "To Art," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an unnerving intensity, "for building such a beautiful family and for creating a legacy we can all be proud of." The toast felt off. It was the way he said legacy, as if it were a business asset to be leveraged. I brushed it off, clinking my glass against theirs. After the main course, as the waiter cleared our plates, Caleb leaned forward, placing his hands together on the table, as if he were about to lead a board meeting. "Art," he began, his tone shifting from celebratory to serious. "Jenna and I have been doing a lot of strategic thinking about our future, about your future too. We want to make sure your golden years are lived with maximum intention and minimal stress." Jenna looked at him, then at me, her expression a little confused but still trusting. "What do you mean, honey?" Caleb's serene smile never faltered. "This old house of yours," he said, the words dripping with a kind of gentle condescension. "It's a magnificent piece of history, but it's an anchor, a burden. The upkeep, the property taxes, the emotional weight of it all. You shouldn't have to manage that alone anymore." A cold knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I set my fork down. "The house is fine, Caleb. I manage it just fine. But imagine," he continued, his voice becoming more animated, "a new chapter. A curated life. There's a community just outside the city, the Magnolia Senior Wellness Community. It's state-of-the-art. Gourmet dining, social clubs, wellness coaches. It's not a retirement home, Art. It's an investment in your well-being." We could sell the house, take that massive asset off your plate, and set you up for a life of complete managed comfort. The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating like the savannah humidity. For a moment, the cheerful noise of the restaurant, the distant clatter of silverware, the murmur of conversations at other tables, the soft jazz floating from unseen speakers all faded into a dull, muffled roar in my ears. Caleb's smile remained plastered on his face, a mask of serene benevolence that now looked utterly grotesque. He was talking about dismantling my life, erasing my home, and he was describing it as if it were a spa treatment. I looked over at Jenna. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and her new husband. She was confused, caught in the crossfire before the first shot had even been truly fired. She saw a misunderstanding. I was beginning to see a declaration of war. I took a slow sip of water, the cold glass a steadying presence in my hand. When I finally spoke, my voice was quieter than I expected, but as solid as the 200-year-old oak trees lining the city squares. "Caleb," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "I appreciate the strategic thinking, but you've overlooked a key variable. The house is not an asset to be liquidated. It's my home, and it is not, nor will it ever be, for sale." I had expected the statement to end the conversation. In a normal world it would have, but Caleb's smile only tightened. He chuckled, a soft, patronizing sound. "Art, art," he said, shaking his head slowly, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "You're thinking with your heart, not your head. That's exactly the kind of emotional liability we're trying to protect you from. Sentiment is a beautiful thing, but it doesn't pay for property taxes or a new roof. It doesn't keep you safe when you're rattling around in a 10-room house all by yourself." "I am perfectly capable of paying my bills, and I am not rattling around," I replied, a sharp edge creeping into my tone. "I live there. That's what a home is for." Jenna reached across the table, her hand touching my arm. "Dad, please, just hear him out. Caleb's just worried about you. We're both worried. You're all alone in that big place." Her voice was a plea for peace, a desperate attempt to smooth over the sudden, jagged rift that had opened in our family. But her words meant to soothe, only twisted the knife. She was already echoing his narrative that I was a problem to be solved, a fragile liability to be managed. "Worried?" I said, looking from my daughter to the man who had her so thoroughly convinced. "Is that what this is? Because it sounds less like concern and more like a hostile takeover bid." The mask finally slipped. A flicker of something cold and hard flashed in Caleb's eyes. The charming life coach vanished, and for a second I saw the predator beneath. "A takeover? Don't be melodramatic, Art," he snapped, his voice losing its silken edge. "We are trying to have a practical, adult conversation about your twilight years. This isn't about what you think you want. It's about what's logically best for your well-being. It's a sound financial and logistical strategy." His use of the phrase twilight years felt like a deliberate blow. He wasn't just talking about my house. He was talking about my relevance, my competence, my right to self-determination. He was trying to age me out of my own life. "My well-being is my own concern," I said, my voice low and firm, "and this conversation is over." I folded my napkin and placed it on the table, a clear signal that the evening was done. The remains of our celebratory dessert sat between us, a sweet, mocking ruin of the happy family we had been just 10 minutes ago. Jenna looked horrified. "Dad, please don't do this. Caleb, maybe this wasn't the right time." Caleb put his hand over hers, silencing her. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more threatening than any shout. "It's all right, honey. Your father is just processing. It's a big change." He looked back at me, his smile gone completely, replaced by a look of steely resolve. "We're only doing what's best for you, Art," he said, each word a carefully placed stone in the wall he was building between me and my daughter. "Sometimes you need family to make the hard choices for you." The drive home was a suffocating silence. Jenna sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, tears quietly streaming down her face. Caleb drove my car with a proprietary air, humming softly to the radio, as if he hadn't just detonated a bomb in the middle of my life. When we pulled into my driveway, he turned to me and said, "Just sleep on it, Art. You'll see the logic in it eventually." I got out of the car without a word and walked up the brick path to my front door. Inside, I leaned against the heavy oak, the familiar scent of old books and lemon oil polish filling my lungs. But it was different now. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a territory under siege. The disbelief that had frozen me at the restaurant began to thaw, melting away into a slow-burning, ice-cold anger. This wasn't a misguided attempt to help. It was a plan, an ambush. It was the opening move in a game I didn't even know I was playing, and I had just become his opponent. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford that night. I spent the long, quiet hours in my leather armchair, the house groaning around me with the familiar sighs of old age. With every creak of the floorboards and rattle of the window panes, I felt a fresh wave of violation. The anger from the restaurant had cooled, leaving behind something harder and more useful, a cold, crystalline suspicion. As dawn broke, casting long gray shadows across the Persian rug, I found myself in my study, sitting before the chessboard. The pieces stood exactly where I had left them, frozen mid-game. But now, the board looked different. I wasn't just playing a game, I was in one. And I needed to analyze my opponent's opening moves. A historian is, at his core, a detective of the past. He sifts through artifacts and accounts to find the pattern, the motive, the unseen thread that connects everything. I closed my eyes and began to sift. For months, Caleb had been a constant, charming presence. His questions, which I had taken for a polite interest in the life of his new father-in-law, now replayed in my mind with sinister clarity. There was the afternoon a month ago, when he'd admired the intricate woodwork in the foyer. "This place is a masterpiece, Art," he'd said, running a hand over the carved newel post. "A real piece of history. What's the zoning like in this historic district? Is the title held in a trust? Just curious from a legacy planning perspective." At the time, I'd been flattered. I had explained the simple deed structure, signed and secured decades ago by me and Eleanor. I had practically handed him a roadmap. Then there was the conversation about finances. "Jenna worries, he'd said one evening, his tone oozing with filial concern. "She just wants to make sure you're secure. Is your pension managed by the university, or is it a private fund? It's so important in this volatile market to have your assets streamlined for maximum efficiency." I'd answered his questions honestly, proud of the secure retirement I had meticulously planned, never once thinking my financial stability was being assessed like a target's defenses. Each memory was a breadcrumb, leading back to the same awful conclusion. This was a long con. My daughter's wedding, the honeymoon, this entire relationship, it was all a calculated strategy to get to this house. The thought of Jenna, so happy and so blind, sent a pang of real fear through me. She wasn't just married to a greedy man, she was married to a predator. My gaze fell upon the old laptop sitting on the corner of my desk. It was a newer model that Jenna had insisted I get last year, and Caleb had spent an entire afternoon optimizing it for me. "Gotta get you up to speed, Art," he'd said with a laugh. "We'll clean it up, make it run faster, get all your accounts synced." He had been so helpful, so patient with my technological fumbling. Now, that act of kindness felt like a home invasion, a Trojan horse left inside my walls. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. It felt foolish, paranoid even, but I had to know. I walked over to the desk, the legs of my chair scraping against the floor in the silent room. I opened the laptop, the screen glowing to life with a picture of a smiling Jenna and Caleb on their wedding day. The image was a cruel joke. My hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as I clicked open the web browser. I navigated to the History tab, my breath catching in my throat. The list that loaded onto the screen was a blueprint for my destruction. It was a chronological record of Caleb's cold, methodical planning, all done from my own study, likely while I was out buying groceries or working in the garden. Quick cash sale, historic home, Savannah, GA. How to sell a house owned by a senior citizen. Georgia elder law, durable power of attorney requirements. Early signs of dementia versus normal age-related memory loss. How to legally contest a will in Georgia. Reviews of Magnolia Senior Wellness Community. I read the list again, and then a third time. Each search term was a punch to the gut. He wasn't just planning to take my house. He was building a case against my mind. The search for signs of dementia was the most insidious of all. He was preparing to paint me as incompetent, a confused old man who couldn't be trusted, a narrative he had already started building at the restaurant. The suspicion I'd felt all night solidified into a block of ice in my stomach. This was real. The neatly typed lines on the screen were proof of a meticulously planned, deeply evil plot. I was no longer just an opponent in a game. I was the prize. And my opponent had just shown me his entire strategy. I stared at the glowing screen, at the list of calculated searches, and a wave of pure, unadulterated fear washed over me. It was a cold, sickening sensation that started in my gut and spread through my limbs, leaving me feeling hollowed out and fragile. This wasn't just a greedy son-in-law, this was a methodical predator. And my daughter, my brilliant, loving Jenna, was sleeping next to him, completely oblivious. For a terrifying moment, I felt paralyzed. The problem felt too big, too insidious. I was a 9-year-old history professor. What could I possibly do against a monster this sophisticated? The chessboard in the corner of my eye seemed to mock me. This wasn't a game of ivory pieces. This was a brutal, real-world fight, and I was horribly outmatched. Then, through the fog of panic, a name surfaced. Mark Donovan, my roommate from my freshman year of college, and my closest friend for the 50 years since. Mark had gone on to become one of the sharpest estate lawyers in Atlanta before semi-retiring last year to a life of golf and consulting. He was the only person I could trust with this, a man whose mind was as analytical as my own, but armed with the power of the law. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over his contact number. Making this call would make it all real, an official crisis instead of a private nightmare. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. He answered on the second ring, his voice as warm and familiar as ever. "Art, you old historian, to what do I owe the pleasure? Don't tell me you've finally unearthed evidence that Blackbeard's treasure is buried under your azaleas." I tried to chuckle, but the sound came out as a strangled croak. "Mark, I'm sorry to call you out of the blue like this. I need your advice. Something's happened." The warmth in his voice immediately shifted to concern. "Art, you sound terrible. What's wrong? Is it Jenna? Is she okay?" "Jenna's fine," I said, the words tasting like a lie. "Physically, at least." I took another breath and laid it all out, trying to keep my voice steady, presenting the facts as a historian would chronologically and without emotion. I described the dinner, the condescending proposal to move me into a wellness community, Caleb's manipulative language, and finally, the damning list of searches I'd found on my laptop. I read each search term aloud, and the silence on the other end of the line was heavy and absolute. When I finished, Mark let out a long, slow whistle. "Sweet mother," he whispered. "Art, this island, this is bad, really bad. The first thing you need to do is go to your safe, get every financial document you own, the deed to your house, your will, your bank statements, and take them somewhere else. A safe deposit box at the bank. Today, do not leave them in that house." "You think he'd actually try to steal them?" "I think this man is planning to steal your entire life, and he's not an amateur," Mark said, his tone now stripped of all pleasantries. It was the voice of a lawyer facing a serious threat. "You mentioned your son-in-law's name is Caleb?" "Caleb Thorne," I confirmed. Another pause, longer this time. It stretched for so long I thought the call might have dropped. When Mark finally spoke again, his voice had dropped an octave, and it was filled with a cold, professional dread that chilled me to the bone. "Art. I've heard that name before." "What? How?" "He's from some tech startup scene in California." "No," Mark cut me off. "Not in person. I'm on a few private online forums for estate and elder law attorneys. We share information, warnings about new scams, predatory guardianships, that sort of thing. It's a place to compare notes on the sharks that are circling our clients." About 6 months ago, a colleague in Florida posted a story about a client, a widower in his 70s. His daughter had just married a charismatic business coach. Within a month, the father was being pressured to liquidate his assets, specifically his beachfront property. The family was torn apart, and the father nearly lost everything. The son-in-law's name was Caden Thorne. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You think it's the same person?" "Wait," Mark said. I could hear the clacking of a keyboard in the background. "Here at Island, the Post." Another lawyer from Charleston chimed in. "Same story, different family. A recently divorced daughter marries a motivational speaker. The target was her father, a retired surgeon with a historic home. The son-in-law's name was Chris Thorne. The MO is identical, Art. They find a target family with a single elderly parent holding a primary asset. They use a vulnerable adult child as the point of entry. They isolate the parent, gaslight them, create conflict, and then use a flurry of legal paperwork forged, most likely to seize control. They're called romance fraudsters or asset predators. He's a ghost. He uses slight name variations, builds a flawless social media profile, then vanishes after he gets what he wants. leaving financial ruin and a shattered family in his wake. There's a ghost file on this guy, Art, a collection of horror stories, but never enough hard evidence to get an indictment. He's too slick. Every word Mark said was another nail in the coffin of the reality I had known. The fear I'd felt earlier was still there, but as he spoke, it began to change. It was a chemical reaction, the raw panic being forged into something else, something harder and heavier. It was the grim resolve of a man who has just been told he is not facing a random mugger, but a known serial killer. I wasn't just a potential victim, I was the next name on a list. My home was the next target in a series of calculated attacks. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this predator's career was going to end right here, in my house, on my board. The phone call with Mark ended, but the echo of his words, ghost file, asset predator, shattered family remained, hanging in the quiet air of my study. The fear was still there, a cold stone in my gut, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had purpose now. It was the whetstone against which I would sharpen my mind. I looked at the chessboard, at the black king cornered by my white pieces. In chess, a defensive position is not a passive one. You don't simply wait for the attack. You build a fortress, anticipate your opponent's moves, and quietly lay the foundations for a powerful counteroffensive. It was time to fortify my defenses. My first move was to follow Mark's advice. I drove to the bank and rented a safe deposit box, the largest they had. One by one, I placed the foundational documents of my life into the cold, metal container. The deed to the house, my will, Eleanor's and my marriage certificate, my pension statements, my birth certificate. Each document I locked away felt like moving a valuable piece on the board to a safer square. By the time I left the bank, I felt a fraction lighter. The physical core of my legacy was now beyond his reach. My second move was to create my own ghost file. As a historian, I believe in the power of the written record. I went to a small, dusty stationery shop downtown and bought a thick, leather-bound journal and a new fountain pen. Back in my study, I opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top. With painstaking precision, I began to document everything. I transcribed the browser history from the laptop. I wrote down verbatim every manipulative phrase Caleb had used at the restaurant. I detailed every suspicious question he had ever asked me, adding dates and locations where I could remember them. The journal became my fortress of memory, a primary source document in the case of Arthur Vance versus Caleb Thorne. I was no longer a confused old man. I was the primary historian of his crimes. With my physical and historical defenses fortified, it was time to scout the enemy's territory. I turned back to the laptop, the machine he had so graciously optimized for me. It was time to use it against him. I began with a simple search for Caleb Thorne, life coach. The results were exactly what you'd expect. A slick, professional website appeared at the top of the list. The homepage featured a photo of Caleb, not smiling, but with a look of serene, thoughtful intensity, staring out over a photoshopped mountain vista. The tagline read, "Caleb Thorne, vertical bar, architect of your authentic truth." The site was a masterclass in corporate, speak, and meaningless inspiration. It was filled with blog posts on topics like harnessing your latent synergy and monetizing your personal narrative. The testimonials page was filled with glowing reviews from clients identified only by first names and last initials. Caleb changed my life. Sarah K. I finally unlocked my potential. David P. I spent an hour trying to find a single verifiable client, a last name, a company. There was nothing. It was a digital facade, as beautiful and as hollow as a movie set. Next, I moved to his social media. His Instagram was a carefully curated highlight reel of a perfect life. Here was Caleb meditating on a beach at sunrise. Here he was laughing with Jenna, a caption about finding his divine feminine counterpart. Here he was in a suit, seemingly giving a talk at a conference. Though the angle was tight and the audience was unseen, I noticed a pattern. In every photo, he was the star. Even in the pictures with my daughter, she seemed like a beautiful prop to accentuate his narrative of success and fulfillment. The comments were all fawning praise from accounts with vague profiles. It was a kingdom of smoke and mirrors. As a historian, I live by the timeline. It is the backbone of any true story. I started to cross-reference his posts, and that's when I found the first crack in the facade. A LinkedIn post from 8 months ago claimed he was attending a 3-month executive leadership summit in Zurich. He'd written a long, rambling post about the global mindset and the importance of international networking. But his Instagram from that exact same period told a different story. It was filled with photos of him and a group of friends on a yacht in Miami, complete with champagne bottles and clubbing selfies. He was in 2 places at once. It was a small lie, but it was a concrete, provable deception. I took a screenshot and saved it to a secure folder I labeled Evidence. The deeper I dug, the more desperate I became to find a connection to the names Mark had mentioned: Chris Thorne, Caden Thorne. I started looking at photos he was tagged in from years ago, scrolling back through the digital history he hadn't curated as carefully. It was tedious work, hours of clicking through profiles of strangers. And then I found it. It was on the profile of a woman from Charleston. The photo was from 2 years ago, long before he'd met Jenna. It showed her and a man with his arm around her. The man was Caleb, but his hair was different and he looked thinner. The woman's caption read, "A year ago today, I met this incredible man. He showed me what it means to live with purpose. So grateful for you, Caden Thorne. Number soulmate number, blessed number, true love." Caden Thorne. My blood ran cold. It was him. It was real. I clicked on her profile. Her posts from the following months told a familiar story. A whirlwind romance, an engagement, a quick marriage. Then, about 6 months later, the posts stopped. Her profile went dark for a while, and when it reappeared, she was posting inspirational quotes about betrayal, resilience, and starting over. There were no more pictures of Caden. He hadn't even bothered to come up with a new line. He'd sold this woman the same fantasy, the same promise of a life together, likely targeting her family's assets just as he was targeting mine now. I felt a surge of nausea, followed by a wave of rage, so pure and so cold it felt like it could have frozen the sun. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was for this woman. It was for the man in Florida. It was for every family he had destroyed and every person he planned to destroy in the future. I took a screenshot of the woman's post, the smiling face of the man who called himself Caden Thorne beaming back at me from the screen. I saved it in the evidence folder. The board was set. My defensive pieces were in place, and now I finally had a piece with which to attack. The folder of evidence on my laptop was growing. It felt tangible, a small but significant weight against the crushing pressure Caleb had exerted. For the first time in days, a sliver of control seemed possible. I had spent the entire morning engrossed in my investigation, and the study had grown stuffy, the air thick with stale coffee and the low hum of the computer. I needed to move, to do something normal, something physical to clear my head. I decided to dust the bookshelves, a task I'd always found meditative. Running a soft cloth over the leather-bound spines of my history books was like shaking hands with old friends. It grounded me in the reality of my life, in the quiet, intellectual sanctuary I had built. I worked my way along the bottom shelf, a section filled with heavy, oversized art history books Eleanor had loved. Behind a thick volume on Renaissance architecture, I saw it. It was a small white plastic square plugged into an outlet I hadn't used in years. A simple USB power adapter, the kind used to charge a phone. It was modern and cheap-looking, starkly out of place against the dark, century-old wood of the baseboard. I frowned, assuming Caleb must have left it behind. With a sigh of irritation at his carelessness, I reached down to unplug it. But as my fingers brushed against the plastic, something caught my eye. A tiny, perfectly round black dot on the face of the adapter, no bigger than the period at the end of this sentence. It was glossy, almost like a minuscule drop of black paint. But it wasn't paint, it was a lens. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. I froze, my hand hovering inches from the device. A spy camera, a tiny, insidious eye, hidden in plain sight, had been watching me in my most private space. The room, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage, a fishbowl. Every private conversation, every late-night moment of worry, every second I had spent at my desk building a case against him, had he seen it all. The sense of violation was so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. It was worse than the threat to my house. This was a desecration. The historian in me warred with the man who wanted to rip the device from the wall and smash it into 1,000 pieces. The historian won. This was not just an insult, it was evidence. My hands shaking with a fury I had to suppress, I went to my toolbox and returned with a pair of fine-tipped tweezers and my phone. I took several pictures of the adapter from every angle, documenting its placement. Then, with the delicate precision of an archaeologist excavating a fragile relic, I carefully unplugged it from the wall. Back at my desk, I examined it under the bright light of my reading lamp. A nearly invisible seam ran along the side. I pried it open with a small flathead screwdriver, and there, nestled in a tiny circuit board, was a micro SD card. My heart hammered against my ribs. What secrets did this tiny black chip hold? Using the tweezers, I extracted the card and slid it into the adapter for my laptop. The computer chimed, recognizing the new device. A folder opened on the screen, revealing a list of nearly 50 video files, each labeled with a date and time. The earliest was from over a month ago, just a few days after Caleb had optimized my laptop. He had been spying on me almost from the beginning. My finger trembled as I clicked on the most recent file, dated just 2 days prior. The screen filled with a wide, static shot of my own study, filmed from the low angle of the bookshelf. For a few minutes, the room was empty. Then, the door opened and Caleb walked in. He wasn't with Jenna. He was alone, and he moved about the room with an air of arrogant ownership, picking up a silver letter opener from my desk and examining it before tossing it back down. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, it's me," he said, his voice the relaxed, casual tone of a man talking to a partner in crime. "Yeah, everything's on track. The old man is a pushover, completely trusting." He let out a low, cruel laugh that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I laid the groundwork at dinner last night, planted the seed. He's probably sitting in here right now feeling confused and sad. It's perfect." He paced in front of the hidden lens, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "The notary is on standby, right? Good. Because once I get his signature, or forge it, whatever comes first, we need to move fast. The house is practically ours." He paused, listening to the person on the other end. No, there won't be any trouble. He's totally isolated." Then came the words that stopped my heart. "And the best part," Caleb said, a genuine mirth in his voice. "The daughter is my biggest advocate, my perfect cover. She's so worried about her poor aging daddy. She'll believe anything I tell her. Hell, she'll sign anything I put in front of her if she thinks it's for his own good." I stared at my own reflection in the dark parts of the laptop screen, my face a pale, grim mask. The man on the recording wasn't just a con artist. He was a monster, a parasite who saw love and concern not as emotions to be cherished, but as weaknesses to be exploited. The violation I'd felt upon finding the camera was nothing compared to this. This was a cold, pure fury, an anger so profound it felt like a force of nature. He had used his own technology, his own arrogance, to provide me with a taped confession. This tiny black chip didn't just hold video files, it held his future. It was the hidden bishop, a piece I never knew I had that had just been activated, and it was about to sweep the board clean. The fury that had solidified in my study the night before did not dissipate with the morning sun. It was a clean, clear energy, a fuel for the task ahead. There would be no more passive investigation, no more hiding in the shadows of my own home. It was time to take the fight to him. I spent the next hour preparing for battle, not with weapons of violence, but with the tools of a historian, evidence, documentation, and an irrefutable narrative. I took the leather-bound journal and placed it at the center of my desk. I printed out every screenshot from my digital reconnaissance, Caleb's fake LinkedIn timeline, the glowing testimonials from his ghost clients, and the damning photo of him as Caden Thorne with the woman from Charleston. I transcribed the browser history onto a clean sheet of paper. Finally, and most importantly, I took the tiny micro SD card and copied the video file, the one I now thought of as the confession, onto 3 separate USB drives. I organized everything into a thick, black, 3-ring binder, creating tabs for each piece of evidence. When I was finished, I was holding a comprehensive, meticulously documented indictment of Caleb Thorne. Walking into the Savannah Police Department felt like stepping into another country. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, and the muted sense of controlled chaos was a world away from the quiet, academic order of my life. I felt out of place, a tweed-jacketed professor in a sea of blue uniforms and hardened faces. After stating my purpose to the front desk, I was told to wait, and for a long, anxious 20 minutes, I sat on a hard plastic chair, clutching my binder like a shield. Finally, a woman in a sharp blazer approached me. "Mr. Vance? I'm Detective Maria Flores. I hear you have some information regarding a fraud case. She was in her 40s, with tired but intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her handshake was firm, her expression professionally neutral, but I could sense the underlying skepticism. She had likely heard 1,000 stories of messy family disputes, and she was already filing mine away in the same mental cabinet. She led me to a small, windowless interview room and gestured for me to sit. "All right, Mr. Vance," she said, pulling out a notepad. "What can I do for you?" I didn't launch into an emotional tirade. I simply placed the black binder on the metal table between us and opened it to the first page. "Detective," I began, my voice as steady as I could make it, "I am here to report a crime in progress. My son-in-law, Caleb Thorne, is a professional fraud artist who is actively attempting to steal my home and assets. This binder contains my preliminary findings." Her eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch at my formal tone, but she said nothing. I walked her through it, page by page. I presented the timeline of events, from the wedding to the shocking dinner. I showed her the printed browser history. I pointed to the evidence of his falsified professional life and the screenshots of his previous identity as Caden Thorne. With each page I turned, I watched her posture change. She went from leaning back in her chair to leaning forward, her pen starting to fly across her notepad. The look of polite detachment in her eyes was replaced by a sharp, focused glint of interest. When I was done, I slid one of the USB drives across the table. "And this," I said, "is a video of Mr. Thorne in my study 2 days ago, confessing his entire plan to an accomplice over the phone, including his intent to forge documents and his strategy for manipulating my daughter." Detective Flores picked up the USB drive and examined it as if it were a rare gem. She stood up without a word and left the room. 5 minutes later, she returned, and she was a different person. The professional mask was gone, replaced by a look of electrifying intensity. She sat down, her eyes boring into mine. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice low and urgent, "we have had an open investigation on a ghost for the last 2 years. A man who moves from city to city, seducing his way into well-off families and liquidating their assets. He uses different names, but his MO is identical to what you've laid out here. We've had victims in Atlanta, Charleston, even as far as Florida, but we've never had enough to get an indictment. The evidence was always circumstantial. The victims were often too confused or embarrassed to make a strong case, and he was always one step ahead." She tapped the USB drive on the table. This is the first time we've ever had him on tape. This is the first time we've had a victim who built a prosecutorial case before the crime was even completed." She leaned forward, a grim smile touching her lips. "He thinks you're a pushover. An easy mark. He has no idea who he's dealing with." For the first time since this nightmare began, a profound sense of relief washed over me. I wasn't a paranoid old man. I wasn't alone. I had an ally. "Caleb Thorne, or whatever his real name is, has been a ghost for too long," Detective Flores continued, her voice now filled with the thrill of the hunt. "Thanks to you, I think we finally have the tools to exorcise him. The question is, Mr. Vance, how would you feel about helping us set a trap?" The question hung in the sterile air of the interview room. How would you feel about helping us set a trap? A week ago, the thought would have been inconceivable. I was a man who found comfort in the quiet archives of history, not in the high-stakes world of police stings. But looking at the determined face of Detective Flores, I felt the last remnants of my fear burn away, replaced by a cold, unwavering certainty. I was the bait Caleb had chosen, and I would be the bait that caught him. "Detective," I said, my voice clear and steady, "you tell me what you need me to do." A rare, genuine smile broke across her face. "Good," she said, "because to catch a predator like this, we need to let him think he's closing in on the kill." The plan she laid out was as elegant and as terrifying as a perfectly executed chess combination. It required me to become an actor, to play the very role Caleb had written for me, the confused, defeated old man. My first performance was the hardest. I had to call him. I had to sound broken, lonely, and ready to capitulate. "Tell him you've had time to think," Flores instructed, her voice a low, steadying presence as we prepped in her office. "Tell him he was right, that the house is too much for you. Tell him you're ready to discuss the transition. Your goal is to get him and his notary accomplice to agree to a meeting at your house to sign the preliminary papers." The most difficult part was the deception it required outside of the plan. I had to lie to Jenna. She called me that evening, her voice racked with guilt and worry. "Dad, I am so sorry about what happened. Caleb he was trying to help. He's so worried about you. I had to bite back the truth, a truth that would have shattered her. Instead, I forced a sigh into the phone. I know, sweetheart, I mumbled. I was just startled. I'm thinking about what he said. The lie felt like swallowing broken glass, but it was a necessary poison. The next morning, a discreet, unmarked van pulled into my driveway. Detective Flores's technical team, two quiet professionals who moved with quiet efficiency, swept my house for bugs. They found Caleb's spy camera on the bookshelf within minutes. Amateur hour, the lead technician muttered, showing it to Flores. We'll leave it in place. No sense letting him know we're onto him. He can record his own arrest. For the next 3 hours, they transformed my home into a stage. Tiny, high-definition cameras, far superior to Caleb's, were hidden in a clock face, a smoke detector, and a hollowed-out book on a shelf. Sensitive microphones were placed in the lamps and behind a framed photograph of Eleanor. My house, my sanctuary, was now a sophisticated surveillance net. The days leading up to the sting were a masterclass in anxiety. Every ring of the phone made me jump. I rehearsed my lines in my head, practicing the quaver in my voice, the defeated slump of my shoulders. I was a historian, a man who dealt in facts and certainties. This world of performance and deception was utterly foreign. Sleep offered little escape, my dreams filled with faceless figures and falling houses. But through the anxiety, a new feeling began to emerge, a sharp, diamond, hard courage. I was not just an actor in this play, I was the director. The day of the phone call, Detective Flores sat with me in my study. He's going to be smug, she warned. He's going to be condescending, let him. The more confident he is, the deeper he'll walk into the trap. Just remember, we're listening to every word. I dialed Caleb's number, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He answered on the second ring. Art, is everything okay? His voice was a slick performance of concern. I took a shaky breath. Caleb, son, I'm sorry about the other night, I began, letting my voice crack just a little. I was emotional. You were right. This old house, it's just too much for one person. The silence on the other end was thick with his unspoken triumph. Art, there's nothing to apologize for, he said, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. It's a big decision. I'm just glad you're seeing the logic of the situation. We only want what's best for you. I know, I said, the words tasting like ash. I'd like to talk about the next steps, about that wellness community you mentioned. If you and your notary could come by, perhaps we could look over the initial paperwork. Of course, Art, he said, barely containing the glee in his voice. We'll be there. How does Friday at 2 o'clock sound? We can bring everything we need to get the ball rolling. Friday at 2 is fine, I whispered, and hung up the phone, my entire body trembling with the aftermath of the performance. Flores gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. Perfect, she said. The trap is set. And so, I waited. Friday arrived under a sky the color of slate. The house was silent, but I knew it was listening. I knew a team of police officers was in a surveillance van parked just down the street, watching a live feed from the camera hidden in my grandfather clock. I sat in my armchair, a book open on my lap, though I hadn't read a single word. I was just a man in a room, a king on a chessboard, seemingly exposed. But I was not the one in danger. I was the trap, and I waited for the sound of the doorbell, the signal that the final act was about to begin. At precisely 2 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. The sound, though expected, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me, a current that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. For a breath, I was just a scared old man. Then, I remembered the cameras, the eyes and ears of the law hidden within the walls of my home. I remembered the woman from Charleston. I was not a victim. I was an instrument of justice. I rose from my chair, my movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the front door. Caleb stood on my porch, a brilliant, predatory smile plastered on his face. He was dressed in an expensive-looking linen suit, the very picture of a successful man here to do a kindness for his aging father-in-law. Beside him stood a shorter, heavier man with shifty eyes and a cheap tie pulled too tight against his fleshy neck. He clutched a worn leather briefcase to his chest. This had to be the notary. Art, you're looking better, Caleb said, his voice booming with false cheer as he stepped past me into the foyer, his hand clapping me on the shoulder with a proprietary force. See? A little bit of decisive action, and the stress just melts away. The notary, whose name I never bothered to learn, followed him in, his eyes darting around the room, assessing the value of my belongings with the practiced gaze of a vulture. I led them into the living room, the stage. Caleb settled into my favorite armchair, as if it were his throne, while the notary took a stiff, formal seat on the edge of the sofa. The cameras were rolling, the microphones were live. The performance had begun. "All right, Art," Caleb said, leaning forward with an air of magnanimous patience. "Let's get this done so you can move on to the next, exciting chapter of your life. Richard here has all the necessary documents." The man named Richard snapped open his briefcase with a loud click and spread a fan of official-looking papers across my coffee table. The documents were thick and heavy, filled with dense legal text and dotted with lines for signatures. Richard slid one to the top of the pile. "This is the primary asset transfer agreement," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "As you can see, your signature is already here, from our preliminary agreement last week. We just need you to initial a few of the codicils." I leaned forward, feigning the confusion we had rehearsed. I squinted at the signature line. The forgery was good, I had to admit. It captured the general shape of my handwriting, but it lacked the confident flow of a signature I had written tens of thousands of times. "My signature," I murmured, touching the paper with a trembling finger. I don't remember signing anything last week." "Are you sure?" Caleb let out a soft, pitying laugh. It was a sound I would never forget. "Art, memory can be a tricky thing at our age," he said. "The royal hour, a deep and profound insult. It's completely normal to forget minor administrative details. That's why you have us, your family, to manage these things. We're your safety net." He tapped the paper. "It's your signature. You signed it when Richard stopped by on Tuesday." It was a blatant, effortless lie. I had been home alone all day on Tuesday, documenting his crimes. I stammered, playing my part. It all seemed so fast. Selling my house. "It is fast," Caleb said, his patience wearing thin. The mask was beginning to slip. "It's called being efficient. We're unlocking the value of a dormant asset to fund your future. It's the smartest possible move." He picked up a pen and pushed it toward my hand. "Now, if you'll just initial here and here." I looked down at the pen, then back up at his smug, expectant face. I saw the flash of greed in his eyes, the absolute certainty of his victory. He saw a checkmate in one move. He had no idea he'd been playing against a grandmaster. I let the pen rest on the table. The feigned confusion fell away from my face, my voice, my posture. The tremulous old man vanished, replaced by the historian who had memorized every fact of this case. I looked him dead in the eye. "That's interesting," I said, my voice suddenly clear and cold as ice. "A minor administrative detail. You know, it's funny what you can forget and what you can't." Caleb's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "What are you talking about, Art?" "I'm talking about your work, Caleb. Your consulting work," I said, leaning back in my chair. "For instance, I was just on the phone with the state police this morning. Before we finish here, I thought we might want to clear up a few things with them first." The color drained from Caleb's face. The notary, Richard, froze, his hand hovering over his briefcase. What does this have to do with the police?" Caleb stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "Well," I continued, savoring every word, "they're just fascinated by your previous projects. Specifically, they're very interested in the work you did under the name Caden Thorne in Charleston and your other portfolio as Chris Thorne in Atlanta. They seem to think there's a pattern." Caleb shot to his feet, the papers scattering onto the floor. "You're senile. You're talking nonsense," he hissed, his face a mask of dawning panic. Richard the notary was already backing toward the door. "I don't know anything about this," he squeaked. "I was just contracted for a signing." But there was nowhere to go. At that exact moment, the front door swung open. It hadn't been locked. Detective Maria Flores stepped into the foyer, flanked by two plainclothes officers. She didn't shout. She didn't draw a weapon. She simply stood there, a vision of calm, implacable authority. "Caleb Thorne," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden, dead silence of the room. "You're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and exploitation of the elderly. Please put your hands behind your back." Caleb stared at her, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a deck. The intricate web of lies, the months of planning, the years of successful predation, it had all come crashing down in the space of 30 seconds. His eyes, once so full of arrogant confidence, were now just hollow pools of disbelief and terror. He had walked onto my board, played my game, and stepped directly into the trap. Checkmate. The click of the front door closing behind Detective Flores echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the living room. Caleb and his sniveling accomplice were gone, swallowed by the waiting police cars. The quiet that descended was heavier than the noise had been. It was a weighted silence, filled with the ghosts of the afternoon's violence and the lingering scent of fear. I stood alone in the center of the room, the forged documents scattered at my feet like fallen leaves after a storm. The sense of triumph was undeniable, a clean, sharp feeling of a complex problem solved, of a game won. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a deeper, colder emotion began to surface. A profound and aching sadness. I had won the battle, but now I had to face the casualties. And the primary casualty was my daughter. Detective Flores had agreed to make the official call. It was better that way, she'd said. The news needed to come from a place of authority, to prevent Jenna from thinking it was some kind of family dispute gone wrong. I drove to the station to be there when she arrived, the short journey through Savannah's familiar oak-lined streets feeling surreal. The world was still turning, tourists were still taking pictures of historic squares, but my own personal history had been irrevocably fractured. I saw her arrive from the window of the waiting area. She ran from her car toward the station entrance, her face pale with panic. She clearly thought something terrible had happened to me. My heart ached for the pain she was about to endure, a pain I had, in a way, orchestrated. I was the one who had set the trap that would now ensnare her heart. Flores met her at the door and led her to the same small, windowless room where I had first presented my case. I waited outside, my hands clasped behind my back, pacing the worn linoleum floor. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of Flores's calm, professional voice, and then a sharp, choked gasp from Jenna, followed by the raw, ragged sound of a soul breaking apart. Inside that room, as Flores later recounted, she laid out the evidence with gentle precision. She showed Jenna the screenshots of Caden Thorne, the proof of a life built on a repeating pattern of predatory deceit. Jenna's initial reaction was denial, a desperate defense of the man she loved. She insisted it was a misunderstanding, a mistake. Then, Flores played the video. She showed my daughter the footage from Caleb's own spy camera. Jenna watched the man she married, the man she adored, pace around my study with the casual arrogance of a conqueror. She heard him laugh as he called me a pushover, and then she heard the final, fatal blow, the words that would echo in her mind for years to come. And the best part? The daughter is my biggest advocate, my perfect cover. She'll sign anything I put in front of her if she thinks it's for his own good. That was the moment she broke. The sound I heard through the door was not just a cry of sadness, but a cry of profound, soul-deep violation. The man she had given her heart to had seen her love not as a gift, but as a tool. Her concern for me had been weaponized against us both. When the door finally opened, Jenna stumbled out, her face a mess of tears and shattered disbelief. Her eyes found mine across the hallway, and for a moment they were filled with a confusing storm of emotions, grief, horror, and a flicker of accusation. "You knew," she whispered, her voice cracking. "All this time, you knew what he was, and you didn't tell me." I closed the distance between us and wrapped my arms around her as she began to sob, her body trembling with the force of her grief. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I murmured into her hair, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry. I'm such a fool," she wept against my chest. "I believed him. I defended him. I pushed you away for him." I pulled back, holding her by the shoulders, so she had to look at me. "No," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "You are not a fool. You have a good and trusting heart, and he exploited that. You were the victim of a professional manipulator who has destroyed the lives of a dozen other families. That is not a reflection of your judgment. It is a reflection of his evil." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for blame, for a hint of "I told you so." She found none. There was only the deep, unwavering love of a father for his child. The vindication I'd felt earlier was gone, replaced entirely by the sorrow of this moment. My victory felt hollow, a strategic win on a board where the most valuable piece, my queen, had been tragically, devastatingly wounded. I drove her home that night, not to the trendy apartment she had shared with Caleb, a place that was now a crime scene, but home. To the old Victorian house on the corner, the place he had tried to steal. As I led her inside, she leaned against me, utterly spent. The house was no longer a territory under siege. It was what it had always been meant to be, a sanctuary, a place for my daughter to begin the long, slow, painful process of healing. The 4 months that followed the arrest were a strange period of quiet healing and tense preparation. Jenna, with immense courage, began the slow process of untangling her life from Caleb's, filing for an annulment and starting therapy. She moved back into the guest room of my house, and together we found a new, quieter rhythm, our bond forged stronger in the crucible of Caleb's deceit. All the while, the legal machinery churned in the background, as Detective Flores's investigation, anchored by my evidence, uncovered a shocking trail of devastation across 3 states. The day the trial began, the Chatham County Courthouse was buzzing. My private battle had become a public spectacle. News vans lined the street, and reporters jostled for position on the courthouse steps. Caleb Thorne, the charismatic life coach, had been unmasked as a prolific predator, and the city was captivated. I walked through the throng with Jenna at my side, her head held high. We were not there as victims seeking pity. We were there as witnesses to the truth. Inside the courtroom, Caleb sat at the defendant's table, looking diminished in a baggy, ill-fitting suit. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen pout. He refused to look at us. The prosecution's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative destruction. The assistant district attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miss Chen, laid out Caleb's entire criminal enterprise for the jury. She spoke of the woman from Charleston, Caden Thorne's former fiancée, who now sat in the front row. She spoke of a retired doctor in Atlanta who had lost his family home to Chris Thorne. One by one, the ghosts from Mark's ghost file were given names and faces. We were not isolated incidents. We were a pattern. The trial unfolded with the methodical precision of a historical thesis. Miss Chen presented my black binder of evidence, projecting my screenshots and journal entries onto a large screen for the jury to see. The digital trail of Caleb's lies, his fake timelines, his hollow testimonials, his alternate identities was laid bare for the world to witness. Then came the videos. First, Miss Chen played the footage from Caleb's own spy camera. The courtroom was utterly silent as the jury watched him pace my study, heard him brag about my supposed naivete, and deliver the cruel, dismissive lines about my daughter. I glanced at Jenna. She watched the screen with a look of quiet, resolute pain, her hand gripping mine tightly. She was not reliving the trauma. She was bearing witness to the crime. Caleb sank lower in his chair, his face pale. Next, they played the highlight reel from the sting operation. The jury saw Caleb's condescending smirk as he presented the forged documents. They heard him patronize me about my failing memory. And then they watched his face crumble in real time as my trap was sprung and Detective Flores walked through the door. It was more than evidence. It was a short film about hubris and its spectacular downfall. Finally, Miss Chen called me to the stand. The prosecution calls Arthur Vance. I walked to the witness box, my steps steady. I was not nervous. This was my territory, the presentation of a well-researched, factual account. Caleb's defense attorney tried to paint me as a vengeful, controlling father who was trying to sabotage his daughter's marriage. I answered his questions calmly and factually. But my real testimony came when Miss Chen began her questioning. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice inviting a narrative, "can you please describe the defendant's methods?" I turned to the jury. "I can," I said, my voice the measured tone of a lecturer. "As a historian, I study patterns in human behavior. The defendant, Mr. Thorne, does not operate with random malice. He operates like a historical campaign. First, there is the reconnaissance phase, where he identifies a target and gathers intelligence on their assets and vulnerabilities. Then comes the infiltration phase, where he uses a trusted family member, in this case, my daughter, as his point of entry, building rapport through charm and deception. This is followed by the isolation phase, where he attempts to sever the target's support system by creating conflict and gaslighting them, suggesting they are confused or incompetent. I paused, looking directly at Caleb. Finally, there is the extraction phase. He uses a combination of intimidation and fraudulent documents to seize the primary asset. This pattern is not new. It's a textbook confidence scheme that has been deployed by predators for centuries. The technology changes, but the predatory strategy remains exactly the same. I wasn't a victim on the stand. I was a professor delivering my final, most important lecture. The defense had no counter-argument. How could they? I had taken their client, their supposed victimizer, and reduced him to a historical footnote, a predictable and unoriginal criminal. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt a profound sense of catharsis. The story was told, the evidence was presented, the endgame was complete. The closing arguments were a mere formality, the final notes in a symphony whose crescendo had already passed. Caleb's defense attorney offered a weak, rambling plea, attempting to paint his client as a misguided entrepreneur who made poor choices. It was a pathetic and unconvincing performance. Then, Miss Chen stood for the prosecution. She didn't raise her voice. She simply and methodically walked the jury through the mountain of undeniable evidence, ending by pointing a finger directly at the defendant. "Philip Green is not a misguided man," she stated, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom. "He is a professional predator who uses love as a lure and family as a weapon, and it is your duty to stop him." The jury filed out. I looked at Jenna, and she gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. There was no anxiety left, only a quiet anticipation. We had presented the truth, as solid and unyielding as granite. The rest was procedure. We didn't have to wait long. In less than 2 hours, a court officer announced that the jury had reached a verdict. As they filed back into the jury box, not a single one of them looked at Philip. A collective, quiet breath was drawn throughout the courtroom. The foreman, a stern-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun, handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. The judge read the verdict, his voice a dispassionate, tolling bell of justice. On the charge of felony fraud, we the jury find the defendant, Philip Green, guilty. On the charge of forgery, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit a criminal enterprise, we find the defendant guilty. With each pronouncement of the word guilty, another chain seemed to lock itself around Philip. He slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant man who had demanded my home. I felt a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. It wasn't glee or a desire for revenge. It was the calm, clean feeling of a complex equation being solved, of a historical record being set straight. Due to the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the number of victims, the judge proceeded directly to sentencing. He stared down at Philip from the bench, his expression one of cold contempt. "Mr. Green," he began, his voice booming with judicial authority, "for 3 years you have systematically preyed upon the emotional and financial vulnerabilities of our senior citizens. You identified trusting, honorable families, and you infiltrated them like a disease, turning daughter against father, exploiting love for profit, and leaving a trail of devastation in your wake." The judge then looked directly at me. This court, however, also recognizes the extraordinary individual who stopped you. Mr. Preston Weaver did not simply become a victim, he became an investigator. He used the very intellect and methodical precision you disdained as a weapon against you. He demonstrated that wisdom is not a weakness and that age is not a disability. His courage and clarity not only saved his own family, but brought justice to a dozen others who were not in a position to fight back. He turned his gaze back to Philip, his face like stone. "You are a parasite on society, Mr. Green, and you have forfeited your right to live within it. This court sentences you to the maximum penalty of 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, all of your known assets, currently frozen by the state, are to be seized and placed into a restitution fund for the victims of your crimes. Bailiff, remove the prisoner." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the final, definitive punctuation mark on the end of Philip Green's criminal career. As 2 officers pulled him to his feet, a broken and defeated man, I felt the last of the tension leave my body. A quiet, profound peace settled over me. The battle was over. The house was safe. Justice, in the end, had been meticulously and satisfyingly engineered. 6 months after the verdict, the autumn sun cast a gentle golden light over Savannah. The air was crisp, and the old Victorian house seemed to breathe a sigh of contentment, its foundations secure, its halls filled not with fear, but with peace. The scars from Caleb's brief, violent intrusion into our lives were still there, but they were healing, knitting us together in ways we never expected. Jenna had found a strength she never knew she possessed. After weeks of therapy and long talks on our front porch swing, she began to channel her pain into her passion. She started her own small graphic design agency, specializing in helping nonprofits and community-focused businesses build their brands. Her heart, once so cruelly exploited, was now the engine of her success, and seeing her thrive was the truest victory I could have ever imagined. Our bond was closer than ever, rebuilt on a foundation of absolute trust and shared resilience. As for me, I found that I could not simply return to a quiet life of books and memories. The experience had awakened a new sense of purpose. I began volunteering with a statewide elder fraud prevention network. Twice a month, I would give talks at community centers and libraries, sharing my story not as a harrowing tale of victimhood, but as a practical lesson in strategy and vigilance. I taught others how to recognize the patterns of a predator, how to fortify their own defenses, and how to use a methodical, historical mindset to protect themselves. My personal ghost file on Caleb became an educational tool, a case study to empower others. This evening I sat on my front porch, the worn mahogany chessboard resting on a small table before me. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jenna was inside, laughing on the phone with a new client. The house was safe. My daughter was healing. A new friend from my volunteer work, a retired detective named Sal, sat across from me, studying the board with a look of intense concentration. He moved his knight, a sly look in his eye. "Your move, Professor," he said with a grin. I looked at the pieces, at the infinite possibilities laid out before me. The game was no longer a battle for survival. It was just a game again, a beautiful, complex dance of strategy and foresight. I picked up my bishop, the quiet, powerful piece that could strike from across the board, and made my move. There was no enemy to defeat, no impending threat to outwit. There was only the calm of a savannah evening, the company of a friend, and the deep, serene peace of a new game, finally and truly beginning.